Thanks. Earlier you said, I hope I'm quoting you correctly, that which seeks and that which is sought is the same. So seeks equals sought, right? So I am that, yes? So if that's the case, how does one account for prayer?
Well, there are essentially two types of prayer, just as there are two types of meditation. In one, the most common kind of prayer, we direct our love or our devotion towards God, towards that. So I direct my love or devotion to that. And the equivalent in meditation, where I direct my attention towards some kind of object, be it a mantra, the breath, the guru, or whatever. So in these types of prayer and meditation, our love in the case of prayer and our attention in the case of meditation are directed away from ourselves towards an object. Now there is a unique form of prayer, and there are numerous types of those kinds of that category. We could call it objective prayer or meditation. There are numerous different types of objective prayer or meditation. But there is another category of prayer and meditation which doesn't require the directing of our love or attention towards away from ourselves towards an object, but is rather the sinking of our devotion or our attention into its source or essence. And that could be called objectless prayer, a prayer that has no object, a prayer in which our devotion has nothing to direct itself towards, or a meditation that doesn't have an object, such as a mantra or a flame or the breath, to direct itself towards. So in the case of prayer, our devotion sinks backwards or inwards towards the source of devotion rather than the object of devotion. And in meditation, our attention sinks backwards or inwards towards the source or essence of attention rather than going outwards towards an object of attention. Now the source of devotion is called love. The source of attention is called consciousness. They're the same thing, exactly the same thing, but we give them two different names depending on whether we are on the path of devotion or the path of knowledge. So, your formulation, I am that, is not an expression of the highest truth. It is a very refined expression. It is one of the great Mahavakyas in the Vedantic tradition. I am Brahman, or I am that. But it is not yet the highest expression of truth. There is a higher formulation, and it is to be found in the Old Testament, when it says, I am that I am. And this, Ramana Maharshi said, was the highest expression that there has ever been of the truth. Because in this case, in this statement, there is no concession to duality. There is no I am that. When we say I am that, we acknowledge that I and that are one. But we are still admitting something called I and something called that. Thou art Brahman. This is that. In all these statements, these Mahavakyas, they are the condensed essence of the Vedantic tradition, but there is a yet higher formulation. I am that I am. I am not that, I am I. Ramana Maharshi, the way he formulated it even more succinctly, was simply I. By which he meant I am I. I am only I. I am only identical to myself. I am not identical to anything. I am not even identical to Brahman. Because there is nothing in myself other than myself with which I could be identified. If there was something in myself other than myself, I would no longer be infinite, and therefore I would not really be what is called Brahman, or God's infinite being. And the Muslims have a similar expression when they say that there is no God but God. It's one of these statements like I am that seems to make no sense at all until you understand it. There is no God but God. What does that mean? But it means that no thing has its own being. The only being there is, in religious language, God's being, infinite, self-aware being. And it's not that everything is that. There are no things to be that. There is just that. There is just God's infinite being, or infinite self-aware consciousness.
Okay, I have a very savvy son who's read your Light of Pure Knowing, and he said, then when I'm praying to myself.
Yes, and you could say to your son, when you're praying to yourself, how much distance is there between the you that prays and the you that is prayed to? In other words, how much distance is there between yourself and yourself? And if there is no distance, what is the activity of prayer? What would be the activity of prayer? An activity is only required to go from A to B. But from yourself to yourself, there is no distance, and therefore no room for any practice, such as the practice of meditation or prayer.
I'm going to just send him to your next retreat. I'm not touching this.
This is why it is said that I, or I am, is God's name.
Yeah.
The I in each of us, the self of each of us, is the only self, if we can call it a self, there is, the only being there is, which is infinite self-aware being, or God's infinite being in religious language. So the knowledge that each of us has, the simple knowledge I am, or the feeling of being that each of us feels, is God's presence shining in each of our minds. We cannot go to the experience of I am because we are already ourself. We can only, there's no distance between ourself and ourself. The knowledge I am is God's presence in the heart. Tell your son that.
Then why do we pray then?
We pray because, as I said earlier, when we are still under when we still feel separate, we feel lonely, cut off, afraid, helpless. We feel something is lacking. We feel afraid that we are going to die. And therefore we reach out of this sense of lack. We reach for something that will complete us. And our culture has encouraged us to reach for objects and substances, and when those have failed, but we have this intuition. Many people have this intuition from a very early age that the resolution of this longing can never be satisfied by an object or a substance or a relationship. And our culture conceptualizes our essential self, the source of peace and happiness, as God outside of ourself. Therefore we have been conditioned as a culture to the ultimate object that we long for, that we hope to, in which we hope to find peace and happiness, is what we call God. And God is conceived at an infinite distance from ourselves. So we feel that we have to make this terrific journey from ourselves to Him, who is at an infinite distance from ourselves, and therefore requires endless prayer and effort and supplication. Whilst all along, the very self that we are is already that for which we long. But our culture has, for the most part, lost this knowledge. Although it is hidden in the Christian religion, this statement, I am that I am, and many others. But for the most part, it's been the ego or the separate self has appropriated the non-dual teaching and has used it to serve its own ends, and therefore it's very hard to find this understanding in the traditional religions, although they were all founded on this understanding originally.
And it's lost in the traditional religions also.
Sorry?
I said it's also lost in the traditional religions because they don't acknowledge it either.
It's present. If you look hard
Dig.
enough, you can find remnants of it or traces of it. But it has been so mixed up with local, temporal, cultural beliefs and practices that it's, let's say, extremely difficult to find it in conventional exoteric religion. Of course, if you have this understanding, you can go back to the traditional scriptures. I did a webinar on Thursday in England before coming here, and there was a man who he was a Muslim, traditional Muslim, and he had come to one previous webinar a couple of months earlier. And he just recently started watching YouTube clips and exploring this teaching. And he came on the webinar, and he was almost in tears when he was saying it. He said, in the last 3 months since I've come across this understanding, I've completely reevaluated my traditional religion, and I've gone back to the Quran and reread it from this perspective. And he said, I couldn't believe it. It's full of references to this understanding, but I completely missed it. But now that now that I'm beginning to understand this perspective, when I go back to my religion, I see that it's all there, encoded. But he couldn't find it in the religion itself. He first had to come to it through this non-dual teaching, and then he could go back to the traditional scriptures and see, yes, there are traces of it there are fragments of it there. Could someone come to this understanding through the traditional religions? Very difficult, I think. but not impossible.
Thank you.